Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming to the Arts of Africa, 4 Decades of Collecting at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts with Richard Woodward. We'll be starting momentarily.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Welcome to our April members event, The Arts of Africa, 4 Decades of Collecting at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts with Richard Woodward. My name is Donna Gustafson. I'm the interim director of the Zimmerli Art Museum. Before we begin, I want to thank Janine Dugust and Whitney Prendergast, who have done a marvelous job of putting together a year's worth of members programs. We very much value our members, and while we miss seeing you on our members' trips, I'm very happy that you're able to join us on these virtual members gatherings. Tonight, we'll be recording the event and we'll post it soon on the museum's YouTube website. I know that you'll have questions for our speaker. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to save all questions till the end of the program, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So I'm so pleased to be introducing Richard Woodward to you. I know you're all looking forward to hearing him speak this evening about his curatorial work at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. As founding curator of the African collection, Mr. Woodward contributed significantly to building one of the country's most comprehensive and stellar collections of African art. The collection includes over 1,200 works and provides a broad geographical and chronological survey of the continent. Mr. Woodward is a graduate of Rutgers College, class of 1972, and he earned an MA in art history from the University of Virginia. He began working at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in 1975, served as interim director in 2000, and until 2010, he was Senior Deputy Director for Architecture and Design, during which time he coordinated the planning and construction of the $150 million expansion that substantially increased the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts gallery spaces for collections and exhibitions. Also at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, he led an effort funded by the Mellon Foundation to provide a comprehensive technical study of the African collection that has resulted in a beautiful book called The Arts of Africa, Studying and Conserving the Collection, which is distributed by Yale University Press. This interdisciplinary research that Mr. Woodward helped develop is an important model for future interdisciplinary research in art history and also in museum studies. So we're delighted to have him here tonight, and please join me in welcoming Richard Woodward. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna, for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak. And hello to everyone. I'm really looking forward to looking at some African art with you. I would like to extend my best regards to Donna and to all the Zimmerli staff with good wishes for the days ahead. Museums are people places, and moving from today to the time beyond COVID presents an unusual challenge. Special thanks are due to Whitney Prendergast for shepherding the program arrangements and Janine Daugust for making the technical arrangements work so smoothly. On a personal note, I grew up about a mile from the Zimmerli in Highland Park and on the same street as Jane Voorhees Zimmerli, who I remember well, and a block over from the Ralph Voorhees family. It is a privilege to honor their family's contribution to the university with my talk this evening. And I always felt at home taking classes in Voorhees Hall. And it's a delight to complete a circle from my introduction to art history in the terrific department at Rutgers through the completion of my long career at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. At Rutgers, I was able to learn from ancient to modern in every subject with excellent professors, and to all of them go my thanks. But African art was not on the agenda here or at the University of Virginia, or at many universities then. Sarah Brett Smith, Rutgers' wonderful professor of African art, was appointed later. In my day, entry into the field of African art came primarily from one of three paths: anthropology, the Peace Corps, very, very important, and knowing collectors. I was fortunate in meeting collectors while at the University of Virginia. Well, I wish I could be present with you at the Zimmerli, or better still, in the VMFA galleries, which you can see behind me. There won't be time to cover everything that's important, but I will touch on the history of African art at the museum, which is tinged with the experience of building the collection in the American South. And to show the vast range and history of the arts of Africa, my selections will step from antiquity to today, widely across the continent, and will include different forms and materials. Now I'm just going to shift to my slide program and get this going. All right, hold on. There we go. The MFA is a state-operated art museum, the first of a handful of such in the United States. The state supports the building infrastructure and basic operations, but the collections are a product of private philanthropy as gifts of art or purchases using endowments established for that purpose. The MFA opened in 1936 with an initial focus on regional and American art. However, the first endowments were established in the 1950s, stimulating the growth of the collections. Here's a VMFA today. By the 1970s, the museum had strong European, American, East Asian, South Asian, modern, and pre-Columbian collections. But from the global perspective it sought to provide, African art was absent. This changed during the 1970s, and that is part of my talk. In 1941, to celebrate the 5th anniversary, the museum organized an immense exhibition featuring the collection of modern art assembled by Walter P. Chrysler Jr. The Chrysler collection presented a dazzling spectacle of modernism, including 89 works by Picasso, 31 by Leger, 22 by Matisse, and 15 by Braque. The exhibition traveled to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and in the catalog, the two directors encouraged openness and thoughtful consideration of the challenges that the modern works would pose, albeit different for each city. Quote, "To the South, this exhibition may come as a shock, for it is the first large showing of the Expressionist masters in this section of the country. To Philadelphia, it may come as final confirmation of experiences already tentatively grasped." I suspect that the reference there is to the Barnes collection, the Widener collection, and others that were already established in Philadelphia. With this exhibition of modern art came the first two African works displayed at VMFA. This Kota reliquary guardian figure from today's Gabon, and a mask from Central Africa. Chrysler had taken an interest in them as sources of inspiration for modern artists. 1 year after the Chrysler extravaganza, a display of African art from Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, stands out as a distinctive venture in view of the region's prevailing racial climate. Many of the African works have been collected for Hampton by William Shepard, a noted African-American missionary who was born in Waynesboro, Virginia in 1865. Shepard attended Hampton before entering seminary, and he served in the Congo from 1890 to 1910, becoming attached to the people of the Kuba Kingdom and developing a close friendship with Chief Maxamalinge. The loan was part of an ongoing relationship between Hampton and the museum. Hampton was among the museum's first institutional members, and significantly, 10 Hampton students participated in an exhibition from Virginia College Art Departments held at the Virginia Museum in 1944. The museum's inclusive stance, remarkable for the South, garnered mention in The Crisis, the journal of the NAACP. In 1943, African art was included in a global exhibition of masks, and another exhibition of African art was staged in 1953. Thus, African art was shown quite early in the Young Museum in 1941, 1942, 1943, and 1953. When the first art purchase endowments were established in the early 1950s, the pace of acquisitions increased. These funds were not restricted to any type of art, thereby enabling the museum to build collections of global scope. Income was put to work almost immediately to initiate a thrust of acquisitions of Egyptian art. To highlight among these works, the first from the African continent to enter the collection is the commanding statue of Senkama Nisken, king of Kush from 643 to 623 BCE. Simultaneously, the museum considered forming an African collection, but in 1954, 2 episodes about starting or not starting an African art collection occurred. In the spring, the director pursued works from a private collection, but they were ultimately destined for Yale. Then in the fall of 1954, the director brushed aside an offer of an important object from a dealer with whom the museum had worked on pre-Columbian art. The director's comment was that the museum had other priorities than Africa. This puzzling change of direction might be informed by events that occurred between spring and fall that year. VMFA's steps to introduce African art into its galleries and to accommodate African American visitors, students, and artists in its segregated programs and classrooms were unfolding in an environment of increasing social and political stridency. When the Supreme Court issued the decision on Brown v. Board of Education on May 17, 1954, the ruling not only struck down the separate but equal doctrine in public schools, but it also threatened to undermine the South's longstanding Jim Crow laws instituting separation of the races. In Virginia, fears of desegregation led to a notorious campaign of official resistance and opposition through the adoption in 1956 of a policy of massive resistance to block desegregation of the schools. During the politically fraught time that followed, the 18-year-old VMFA went silent on African art for the next 16 years. With far-reaching changes taking place in the state's political and judicial landscape, in 1970, the landmark touring exhibition, Sculpture of Black Africa, the Paul Tishman collection, was engaged to fill the museum's loan galleries. And to provide access to African art throughout the state, since this is a statewide museum, a traveling artmobile exhibition was developed with loans from the Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. Thus, with 300 works in the Tishman exhibition and 49 in the artmobile, the new decade opened with African art at front and center at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Museum leadership also then included the first 2 African American trustees. Public response to the Tishman exhibition was so very positive that a second loan was arranged with the collector right after the exhibition closed. Ultimately, following yet another exhibition in 1975, the VMFA took steps to form its own collection. And by unanticipated timing, 1975 was the year I joined the museum staff. Any decision to collect prompts a question: how do you form a collection? What scope and parameters should you aim for? Humorously, it could be said it is easy at first. Find a great work of art and proceed. Since you have nothing, you need it. And gradually, it grows more complex. In the earlier years up to the 1970s and 1980s, meaning the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, African collections largely focused on masks, sculpture, and regalia from Western and Central Africa, an Atlantic perspective, we might say. However, this map of early culture regions and land and sea trade routes confirms Africa's long and complex history and its connectedness to the broader world. And the history of the Indian Ocean side is more ancient than the Atlantic side. Trade with the Arabian Peninsula, with the subcontinent, India and China and Indonesia, Egypt, so on through the Red Sea, was going on for thousands of years before the Atlantic became, shall we say, the conquest of the Portuguese and Spanish. As you will see as we move forward, I have pushed the envelope to look at all corners of the continent and from ancient to contemporary. The first work acquired is this dramatic mask from the Kuba Kingdom in Central Africa. Coincidentally, the kingdom that William Shepherd had befriended. Its name is Boom, and it is one of 3 royal masks that connect the Kuba founding mythology with political statecraft. Many legends surround its origin and identity, including that of a nature spirit, a pygmy, the common man, and the king's brother. The mask's distinctive form, with swelling forehead and aggressive jaw, was carved from wood in the form of a helmet to fit over the head. Then the surface was richly adorned with cowries, glass beads, copper sheeting, and other costly materials. These attachments attest to the multiple steps involved in making the mask and to the long-distance trading networks required to secure materials, such as the cowries from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean and the glass beads, these in particular from European sources. Assembling the mask included the addition of an elaborate costume of fabrics and grasses and feathers, followed by celebrating its arrival in the community and the spectacle of its performances. Amid the clamor of many hunters, the excitement surrounding the arrival of a new Boom mask, in that circle there, can be seen in this photograph taken in 1971. Well, this picture and this picture show you what has become, give you a sense of what has become of the collection since making that first acquisition. As Donna mentioned earlier, we now have some 1,200 works in the collection from throughout the continent. Moving in for a closer look at one of the sculptures, one of the masks, this sculpted head crest is named Chiwara, and it means farming animal. Or as the Bamana people of Mali think of it, excellent farmer. This mythical creature is revered for teaching good farming practices. Its elegant form combines an antelope's neck, lion's mane, and the short legs of an aardvark or pangolin. But something is missing, and the following account will fill in some details. Meet David Levine, an American doctor who moved to Banjul in the Gambia about 15 years ago to volunteer at the Royal Victoria Teaching Hospital. David has since established a charity to help rural medical clinics. In 2006, Levine saw this ensemble of masks when they were brought to Banjul to perform in a festival. In this photo, they are performing later that year in their remote home village of Sinabamina in Mali, almost 1,000 miles from Banjul. Levine befriended Nahun Kumare, master of the masks, who can be seen at the right in the magenta-colored outfit, and later went to Sinabamina, the last stretch, by horse-drawn cart. While there, he contributed to funding the school, consulted on medical needs, and with the approval of village elders, he was allowed to purchase the complete mask ensemble that you just saw. Here we see the beginning of a performance of the masks, and you can notice the two tall chihuahuas in the center background approaching the community. Chihuahua headcrests perform in pairs, male and female, to express the ideal of marriage and family. Men and women together join in the performance. You can see them here. And as men dance the masks, women sing and sometimes dance beside them. Here the masks can be seen in the distance, as I mentioned. Chihuahuas generally dance at times of planting and harvest, instruction and initiations, and other significant events in community life. Later, to raise money for his charity, Levine offered the masks to VMFA. That was 2014. It was exciting to bring such a complex and well-documented work into the collection. The syntax of the gallery is that of stillness and permanence, making it ideal for seeing the object. But performance is movement, music, singing, fleeting moments where the mask rustles and raises dust as it moves, while you catch but a few glimpses of it. The wooden headcrests are not considered finished when the carving is done, because they are activated by the addition of empowering elements, including horns, beads, and cascading fibers. By comparison, the mask collected earlier on the left retains none of its attachments. This is so often the case when we see masks in museums, masks of any type, that they have their costume, their outfits have been removed. The practice of separating elements of a mask alters a work intended for performance, aligning it with a Western concept of sculpture. Sometimes the attachments are removed by the collectors, and sometimes they're removed by the original owners because they are considered so important. The mask components, you see the red circle there. The mask components are believed to possess spiritual energy, or nyama, which can both create and destroy, and which must be carefully managed and sustained by application of potent materials. For example, the dance sticks are empowered by horns fixed to them and by a buildup from repeated anointments. The cascading fibers have been darkened by soaking in an herbal brew. Now, here's a story of our conservation project that Donna mentioned at the start. We worked on for several years, courtesy of the Mellon Foundation. When David Levine sent the costumes to us, those beautiful fibers were all clumped up, and they were dried and very brittle. And they posed a real dilemma. Can we save them? They're so important in the overall concept of the piece. Would we have to make new raffia? Could we get new raffia from the village? All these questions were asked. And then, as so often happens in conservation, a miracle. Casey Mallinckrodt, who you see on the left, working with several interns, humidified and straightened, relaxing the fibers, straightening them and repairing them as need be. And the masks are well on the way to being displayed now with their fibers intact. It is an absolute, conservators might call it science, I call it a miracle. That conservation work, what you just saw, takes place in the Susan and David Good Conservation Center for Advanced Study in Art Conservation at VMFA. And I circled where that is in our building. It was a very major program element for the 2010 edition. It provides us with a great amount of space and equipment for conducting the kind of research that we do. And the conservators know that I consider conservation to be a true center of learning inside the museum. Here, Hlengiwe Dube, who is Zulu from South Africa, served as a consultant with us in installing on mannequins 2 of our really wonderful Zulu outfits. So you see her to the right there, advising Ainsley Harrison and Kate Gabrielli on the project staff. This is a really wonderful slide. Ndubisi Ezulomba, who is on our project team, is at the left. Casey Malincrot, conservator, to the right center. And Dr. Ada Bekpa, who is a physician practicing in New York, but significantly is the son of the king of Nigeria's Idoma people, came down to consult with us about the figure that you see at center, the white figure, which is an Idoma sculpture that we have in the collection. And he was really quite thrilled at what we were doing. And our conversations were preparatory to Andy Ezulomba then traveling to Nigeria to do some research in the field. And we also engaged with a number of scientific laboratories, especially through Virginia Commonwealth University. In the center, in the right slide, you see chemical and proteomic mass spectrometry, and in the right, nanomaterials characterization. So really getting close to these objects and characterizing and coming to know what the material constituents are. And on the left, taking a sample for thermoluminescence dating of a terracotta piece in our collection. Very exciting work. It's absolutely thrilling. And a lot of our findings are presented in the book that was mentioned. With this extraordinary terracotta sculpture, we remain in Mali and at a location not far from Sinabamina, but we go back hundreds of years. As it flows through Mali, the Niger forms a rare mid-river delta where annual flooding replenishes the land across hundreds of miles. Bordering the Sahara, this inland delta has been the locale for successive empires and a crossroad of trans-Saharan trade for several millennia. What Western Africa had in abundance was gold. Conversely, it lacked copper. One of the most ancient and important sites in the delta was Djenné-Djenné, or ancient Djenné, established during the first millennium BCE on the Bani River, which is a tributary to the Niger. Djenné developed into a thriving center of culture and commerce. Then in the 12th century, fabled Timbuktu arose on the edge of the Niger at the other end of the delta from Djenné. There, river travel transitioned to camels for crossing the desert and vice versa. Oops. Excuse me. With the Niger as their highway, the merchants of Djenné and Timbuktu managed a great flow of imports and exports. This challenging sculpture depicts a kneeling hunchback figure with 8 serpents writhing over the body. Serpents are an important motif in the art and mythology of cultures in the Delta and more broadly in African art. Beginning in 1940, finds of long-buried terracotta statues from the Djenné region started coming to light, but archaeological evidence was absent until systematic excavation started in the 1970s. The ancient culture of Djenné-Djenné has vanished with time because the site and context where this figure was found is not known. It is difficult to fully understand the sculpture's meaning and use. Some of the oldest surviving copper alloy jewelry from Western Africa has been unearthed in the Djenné region. More than 100 examples donated to VMFA consist primarily of brass. The greenish color that you see here results from reaction of the copper with elements in the soil. When first made, they would have been polished to a golden luster. Based on their material composition, copper alloy objects from the inland delta and other sites in Western Africa tell a story beyond local manufacture and use. Given the lack of large-scale copper deposits in Western Africa, the abundance of brass used for jewelry in Mali and sculpture in Nigeria raises questions about the metal's source. Isotopic analysis of the traces of lead in these objects indicate that the metal originated from mines in Northern Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Europe. While gold was traded along Saharan routes from south to north, copper and copper-based metals were transported the other direction since at least the early first millennium CE. A stunning example of the copper trade was encountered in 1962 at a desert site in southern Mauritania, where a cache of more than 2,000 brass rods from the 11th, 12th century was discovered in the middle of the desert. Isotopic analysis revealed that the metal likely came from Europe. The weight of nearly 2 tons demonstrates the substantial volume of trade in metals by camel caravan. More recently, copper alloy objects uncovered in Burkina Faso have yielded correlation with metals from Roman North Africa, providing evidence that long-distance trade was established by the 3rd to 7th century. With the rise of European seagoing commerce in the late 15th century, the majority of the metal trade shifted to the West African coast. Ships could carry far greater tonnage than camels. In the 1990s, discoveries of ancient terracotta sculptures in the Sokoto region of northern Nigeria, such as this commanding figure, added another new chapter to the history of early African art. Sokoto figures are characterized by simplified cylindrical bodies, powerfully modeled heads, and heavy eyebrows. Thermoluminescence dating of the terracotta fabric has yielded a date range for this figure from the 5th century BCE to the 5th century CE. It's earlier than the works uncovered in Mali and contemporary with Egyptian art from the third intermediate to the early Roman periods. The Sokoto River is a tributary of the Niger, and its source connects closely to the network of rivers leading east to Chad and beyond towards the Nile. In the wetter phase of the Sahara, before the rise of Egypt, it is generally agreed that the waters of Lake Chad were some 40 meters higher than today, giving the lake an enormous spread at the center of a network of rivers stretching from the Red Sea to the Niger. These waterways facilitated early human movement, trade, and civic development, to which this Sokoto figure relates as a later descendant. Motherhood is a frequent theme in African art, as it is globally, to be sure. And in Egypt, the dominant image of motherhood is Isis nursing Horus, which you see on the left, where Horus sits across his mother's lap. This configuration was produced in vast numbers, large and small, and the cult of Isis spread across the wider Mediterranean world from the Near East to Britain. The relief on the right reminds us of this dispersion. It comes from an important temple of Isis in Egypt, from which other relief panels were removed to decorate a new temple to the deity that was erected in Rome near the Pantheon in the 1st century AD. The pairing of mother and child across the lap became a compositional archetype that influenced Christian depictions of Mary and Jesus in the art of Egypt's early Coptic church and in Byzantine and Roman churches. A focus for religious devotion, this Ethiopian triptych presents the Virgin and Child guarded by angels and flanked by scenes of the crucifixion and resurrection. In the side panels, in the side panels that you see on the picture. Although the style of the painting is indelibly Ethiopian, the central image of Mary and Jesus adheres in detail to the famous Byzantine icon, now in the Roman Basilica, Santa Maria Maggiore. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Jesuit missionaries transported reproductions of the Santa Maria Maggiore icon to Ethiopia, where the composition has often been repeated. The ancient kingdom of Aksum, Ethiopia's predecessor, adopted Christianity as the state religion in the early 4th century. In the service of the faith, artisans started fashioning crosses, and the kingdom minted coins emblazoned with the cross and profile images of the king holding a cross. The tradition continues, including at the Ethiopian church here in Richmond, where 3 ornate processional crosses, 2 gold and 1 dark wood to the left of the screen, can be seen. Over the past 1700 years in Ethiopia, crosses have been produced in great abundance using many different materials, especially wood and metal. However, information about how they are made is surprisingly scarce, and technical analysis of metal crosses is in its infancy. Continuing the work started during our multi-year project, VMFA Conservator Ainsley Harrison has just published her research into the historical trends in the alloys used at different times. Findings can inform preferences and access to materials. When her research is merged with examination of more crosses and other collections, results will build a foundation of data to complement design and cultural studies, hoping to better understand the overall chronology of design and production. Now we move to Central Africa to look at several historic works and some contemporary works. The Kingdom of Congo, and that's spelled with a K, which spread over a large swath of the Atlantic coastal region from Angola to Gabon, is the source of the sublime image on the cover of our new book. This is a commemorative portrait head memorializing a woman of high standing. Her face was whitened with chalk and kaolin, the color white being associated with the realm of ancestral spirits. Poetically, her almost closed eyes, called Mihiso Malembalala, refers to the setting sun. An X-ray image shows the extent to which the interior of the head has been hollowed out. How was this head used? We can obtain an idea from a French engraving of a Congo funeral dating about 1787, where a massive coffin was being hauled on a wheeled cart. An effigy head is mounted atop the coffin. Holes around the base and neck in the museum's head indicate that it was once lashed to something, possibly an effigy in human form, or a coffin as seen in this early print. A large rectangular opening in the back of the head provides access for inserting relics, relics of the deceased, or other magical or medicinal materials, not unlike medieval European reliquaries. The cavity tells us that both the interior and exterior are essential aspects of this compelling work. Even the eye slits are carved through the wood fabric, linking exterior with interior and implying a watchful state of the ancestors towards the living. We will see this relationship of interior and exterior develop to an even greater extent in the next work. Kneeling expresses reverence to a higher power. In this instance, by a mother seeking a cure for her sick child. Sculpture is a type of power figure employed by a diviner to reveal problems and to propose remedies. In this case, the cause of the illness of the child turns his face away from the nourishment of his mother's breast and clutches his stomach, indicating a disturbance within the body. This figure has 2 internal cavities. One aperture is cut into the back and the other in the top of the head. So you see the 2 apertures there, openings there. The 2 are connected through the neck. These hollows were probably filled with medicinal potions prepared by the diviner who used the statue. Residues remain in both cavities. 3 channels, in addition to the internally connected cavities, 3 narrow channels pierce the wood through the mouth, through the nose, and through the eyes. And they meet in the center of the head. These channels tell us that the figure is considered sensorially alive and active as an agent, detecting clues that will be revealed through chants and interrogations during a session with the child, a divination session with the child's family. And this will help determine that perhaps sorcery or ritual impurity, or perhaps just plain illness might be the matter. In short, this is not just a statue of a mother and child, but it is a medium engaged by the ritual specialist when needed and put safely away when not. Today's Democratic Republic of the Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, an event commemorated by the artist Chibumba Kanda Matulu, in this painting showing Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the newly independent nation. He was giving his speech in which he harshly criticized Belgium and called for national unity. Notice the little flag on the left with 6 small stars for the 6 provinces and the single large star for a bright future. This is the flag of his era, Congolese Unity. Despite the promise that Lumumba represented, the country quickly devolved into political instability and civil war. Among other conflicts, with Western support, Katanga, Katanga province, one of the world's most important mining centers, sought to secede from the nation. Around the time of independence, a genre of popular painting or urban painting developed in Kinshasa, the capital of the country, and in Lubumbashi in Katanga province. Chibumba, who was from Lubumbashi, was a leading exponent of this style of painting. He wanted to be a history teacher, but being unable to do so, he decided to paint history using house paint, simple brushes, and makeshift canvases of flour sacks. Patrice Lumumba's term as prime minister was tragically short, June to September 1960, followed by his arrest and killing along with 2 others in his administration, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, in January 1961. Chibumba's painting, The Historic Deaths of Lumumba, Mpolo, and Okito, is a sensitive pain in which the sky becomes a flag of remembrance for the goal of the martyred leader. Chibumba vanished and is presumed to have died around 1982. And given the political nature of his paintings, he might have been a target of the dictator Mobutu's secret police. Victor Bol, a Belgian professor who taught at the universities of Kinshasa and Lubumbashi from 1957 to 1979, had purchased 33 paintings directly from the artist, all of which are now in the VMFA collection. Like the painter Chibumba, Sammy Baloji was born in Lubumbashi. The region is incredibly rich in mineral resources, including copper, cobalt, uranium. And during the colonial era, the Anglo-Belgian mining company, Union Minière de Haute-Katanga, or UMHK, built an enormous smelting plant in Lubumbashi. The company was highly productive, generating great wealth for the owners. Conditions changed drastically after military dictator Mobutu Sese Seko took control of the country in 1965. Mobutu nationalized the company, and through mismanagement and outright corruption, productivity diminished, and the mining and smelting infrastructure fell into disrepair. In 2006, Baloji was commissioned to document the imprint of colonial period on Lubumbashi. While at the site of the smelting plant, he found archival photographs from the colonial period that had been left behind, and he superimposed extracts from these on images with his own photos of the derelict smelting plant, creating a series of haunting photo montages. From the time of the Manhattan Project through the end of the Cold War, the United States invested heavily in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to claim a share of uranium and other mineral deposits. The uranium used in the Little Boy atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima came from the Shinkolobwe mine, which had been under control of UMHK. Today, minerals from the region are integral to cell phones, electric car batteries, and other devices that the minerals continue to be pursued by various competing international interests. We will now conclude by shifting our sight to South Africa. Zulu women are noted for their sophisticated beading, where they merge color and design in creating coded messages. Each Zulu region has its own style and color combination, so you can recognize where a person comes from by the way they are dressed. For example, the blue, green, and black and white beads of this elaborate outfit are hallmark colors of Mafumalo, a district north of Durban. Twangiwe Dube, who you saw earlier, worked closely with our conservators. She has written that this amazing outfit was worn by a woman of high social position for her wedding ceremony and reserved thereafter for special occasions. A woman normally beads her own attire, planning the pattern and colors to complement her status and the messages she wants to convey. Besides signifying a region by color, some patterns also bear poetic associations. The design on the love letter, the beaded panel attached to the necklace, is a symbol for a lantern that tells her husband, "You bring light to my life," while the colors of the lantern communicate fidelity, blue, longing, green, and marriage or the desire to marry, black. So if a young man gets a beaded panel from his girlfriend and there's any black on it, that is a statement that she wishes to marry. By wearing this love letter, the woman expresses her love to her husband while also displaying it for others to see. Plangy was absolutely wonderful, showing us the proper posture that we should adopt for the mannequin. How would a Zulu woman stand? Not upright, which would be confrontational, but leaning slightly forward, leaning on a cane or an umbrella, and holding a hand behind the back. Plangy is a beadwork artist and historian, and she learned her craft from her mother, Nesta Zondi, and from her grandmother, who you see here with Plangy, Madlamini Dube. Plangy's grandmother started collecting Zulu beadwork in the 1960s, and the efforts of all three women collecting and recording information from their makers and owners is credited with making an invaluable contribution to the preservation and knowledge about Zulu beadwork. The man's outfit seen here on the right was collected, in fact, by Plangy's mother, Nesta Zondi, directly from its maker, Mantuli Biela. Mrs. Biela had made it for her husband around 1960, and the garments were collected in the 1980s. Mrs. Biela was selling it after her husband had passed away. 5 love letters worn from bottom to top in the order in which they were given, worn around the man's neck, from bottom to top in the order in which they were given, express the couple's developing relationship. The topmost one, where you see the word Izazi, praises the husband's wisdom. It's easy to see how Zulu beadwork is a statement of personal identity. Here we see a very different form of identity that came to be enforced in South Africa, the notorious passbook, an icon of apartheid that stipulated where a Black South African was allowed to work and travel. As a white person who employed a Black gardener, the artist, Sue Williamson, had personal experience with passbooks, having to sign the gardener's book monthly so he could live and work in Cape Town. In 1990, when Williamson wanted to use a passbook for an art project, she found John Ngesi, who still carried his every day, even though the passbook law had been repealed 3 years earlier in 1987. Williamson realized that although it was a hated instrument of control, it provided a certain element of security, and she collaborated with Ngesi to make for 30 years Next to His Heart, which you see on the left completely, documenting the pages and showing Ngesi's hands touching some of the pages and slipping it into or out of his jacket. The image that you see behind me is our murals, large wall paintings. They're on canvas, though, not directly on the wall, that we commissioned from Esther Malhandu. Esther is an Ndebele artist. She is now in her middle 80s and was 79 when she came to Richmond to paint these in situ. She became well known in the art world in 1989 through the very renowned exhibition, Magicien de la Terre. And she was very troubled about the idea of going to Paris. She was actually quite scared. But once she got there and she saw that people appreciated her art and she could spread her sense of design more widely, she just took to painting with abandon, and now she actually loves commuting on 747s. She's done a lot of painting globally. The designs for the paintings, Ndebele paintings, derive from beadwork. As you see, Esther on the left and Miriam, her granddaughter, on the right, in the photograph on the left, and you see them working while they were here in Richmond. And they ultimately were applied in South Africa to domestic dwellings. This was a form of resistance. The Ndebele were losing their land, and so they transferred the imagery from their beadwork onto their houses as a statement of identity, a very strong statement of identity, and in fact, rather incredible design. Esther has become very, very, very famous in South Africa and globally, and she was awarded a doctorate at the University of Johannesburg in recent years. And at the bottom right, I'm showing you, she painted BMW art car number 12. BMW has an art car program. Alexander Calder was the first one to paint one. So all you have to do is Google BMW art car and you'll find what is considered the favorite car, the most famous of the BMW art cars. The last artist we will look at is Dumile Feni. And he actually worked in the area of Rutgers, between South Jersey and New York City, Jersey City, and so on. It was kind of an appropriate way to bring this home. This very moving work is one of a series of powerful over life-size heads by Dumile, created while living in exile in the United States. Exile from South Africa. The profoundly human character of Dumile's sculpture impressed African-American artist and former Rutgers professor Mel Edwards. His is a sculpture of very powerful social content. The subject of oppression is often used, but rarely with the eloquence and power of Dumile Feni. Dumile's life paralleled the era of official apartheid in South Africa, which those dates were 1948 to 1991. He was beaten and jailed for protesting, an experience that resonates in drawings that plumb his horrid memories. Upon fleeing in 1968, Dumile lived in London and then the United States, primarily in New York, where he found company among other South African expatriates. Sadly, in 1991, just when the abolition of apartheid made it possible for him to return home, he died in New York City of a heart attack while shopping for jazz CDs to take to his family. Almost always short of money, Dumile had trouble maintaining a studio or apartment. He moved often, staying for a while with the South African sculptor Isaac Witkin in Pemberton, New Jersey. And he lived in Jersey City in quarters offered by African musician Q Masekela. At times he left drawings behind when he moved, or he gave them to friends to hold. And given the cost involved, he was only able to cast a few of his sculptures in bronze. This one was, the one that we had was cast posthumously. Many of the works that were just left in clay have been lost altogether. And as Isaac Witkin noted in a letter, we are lucky to have what we have of Dumile's work. When Dumile left South Africa, his wife was pregnant with their daughter, Mariam Yale. In recent years, Mariam has accomplished the inspired task of gathering works by her father and creating the Dumile Feni Family Trust to preserve and promote his art. Echoing Isaac Witkin, I feel very lucky to have these works by Dumile in the museum for all to see. Well, we have sped through the collection and only scratched the surface of some works, but I have enjoyed sharing this much with you, and I hope I have provided a sense of the breadth, scope, and the wondrousness of the sculpture of the arts of Africa. Thank you very much, and of course I'm open to questions.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone that they can go ahead and use that Q&A feature to submit their questions. And while those come in, I know Donna had a question for you.
Okay.
Oh, Donna, you're muted.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Richard. I really enjoyed seeing so many wonderful works and hearing the stories behind so many of those fantastic acquisitions. And I had a lot of questions, but this question I think would be very interesting for the audience. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how important was it for you to build this collection in Richmond? You sort of alluded to, you know, the sort of, well, the connections with Hampton University, of course, and then, you know,
I could go on for 40 years discussing this, but I think the short answer was that while I looked at it in one way as the completion of the museum's global scope, which was its intention, that the museum would be imperfect, would be incomplete until African art was represented. I was well aware of the locality in which I was working and the sensitivity to the subject, and given the history of segregation in the South. And so, although the museum had made, I hope I tried to demonstrate that the museum made valiant attempts to be inclusive through all those years. And they were really, there are many other details that I could bring up, that did not want to segregate their operations, but they were forced to, being a state agency. That the museum had grown to be a sort of sense of white exclusive club. And many people did not feel welcome at the museum as a result of this long, long history. So one of the goals that we had in building this collection, and in fact with all of our collections, is to reach out to the as broad a community as we can. We have an obligation to do that as a tax-supported institution, of course. So we made very, very special efforts, and wonderfully in the 1990s, we had a large grant from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, which was to engage a collection with a community, and we engaged the African collection with the African American community. And out of that sprang our Friends of African American Art. And so it's a long building process of gaining trust and getting people engaged. And I'm glad to say that I think VMFA has made tremendous progress on this front. And that I think the African collection was part of that. So I hope that answers your question, at least reasonably.
Yes, no, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I have another question too. Have you had an issue in your museum with patrimony claims, and do you feel some of this art should be returned?
That's a very, very fair question. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts has an office that deals with repatriation. And we have actually repatriated several European paintings. And we have had repatriated to us several German expressionist paintings that belong to a collector whose collection came to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. So it was an interesting sort of, it goes both ways. You know, there are a variety of ways of looking at the repatriation issues. And I think there could be a small handful of objects that at some point might be subject to repatriation claims. But I think the good that the objects are doing here is very, very important and should not be overlooked. The other thing is, we had a wonderful experience. I showed a Jene terracotta earlier, the figure with the serpents twining around it. That was back in the 1970s and 1980s, the benchmark was the UNESCO Convention 1970. It was an object in its native country after 1970 or before 1970. This sort of arbitrary line was drawn in the sand. And different countries signed on to the UNESCO Convention at different dates. Some are still signing on today. They didn't agree with it right away. Well, we acquired that terracotta in the 1980s, and it was close to the time when Mali was signing on to the UNESCO Convention. Unbeknownst to me, that object appeared in the museum, courtesy of a dealer bringing it in to show to me. And I thought to myself, my goodness, I have two options here. I can say, no, we shouldn't deal with that because that's a very significant piece. Then I don't know where it goes. You lost control. The other thing that you could do is to invoke a museum privilege, which is to say, I'd like to take that on consideration because dealers know you'd need time to make an acquisition. I did that. And I immediately went to our director and said, I've got this very interesting work here. I think we need to discuss this. And he said, oh, well, I know Alpha Konare, who's the cultural minister of Mali. In fact, I'll see him at a meeting next month. So why don't you give me some photographs and I'll discuss it with him. When he came back from the meeting, our director said, we'll go ahead and acquire the object. The response had been that while this would be a wonderful work in the National Museum in Mali, it would be an excellent ambassador for their culture in the United States. And so the cultural minister suggested that we go ahead and acquire it. Most of our works have appropriate papers. Some of the lesser works that are in the art trade, they're not so much a worry. But I have a larger thought that I've been mulling on, and that is, where does Africa end? And is Africa only a continent, or is Africa a people wherever they are in the world? And do they deserve to have the opportunity to see their art and their culture wherever they may be? It's an interesting question, and I will leave it at that. Right now, we do have one Benin plaque in the museum. There is a Benin dialogue group centered in Germany. And I think we'll wait to see what wisdom comes out of this. They're developing a museum in Benin City now in Nigeria. And so I think we will follow that current as it develops with the many, many voices who are participating in that dialogue.
Wonderful. We have another question. What are the crossovers between Egyptian art and African art? Would you be able to speak?
Egypt is in Africa. Sorry, it's very simple. And the history of Egypt, the history of the Sudan, the history of Ethiopia, all of that. Egyptology got an earlier start, but it's all part of the continent. And if we're going to talk about African art, we're not just going to talk about art from West and Central Africa, which is basically where most slaves in the United States came from. We have to include East Africa, the Indian Ocean coast, North Africa, South Africa. Many of these areas are less represented in African collections. And I have a very good working relationship with our curator of ancient art. And he helped review and work with me on the entry for the Egyptian pieces that we did in the book. And I think this is the way dialogue should go. We do have one Egyptian sculpture in the so-called African gallery. It's a signpost to go to the other gallery because museums are abstract creations and they're not a sphere in 4 dimensions, as it were. So you can't reconstruct the world perfectly inside a work of architecture. The same could be asked about modern art. and African art. And with our curator of modern and contemporary art, John Ravenel, a number of years ago, we had this discussion as well. I was thinking of buying something that was contemporary. We didn't end up buying it, but we had this wonderful discussion. And the director asked us, now, if you buy that work, which gallery is it going to go in? And both of us answered the same. It can be displayed in either, okay? They have a home in either. So there's this cross-pollinization and cross-fertilization that I think is very valid. And that's the way we look at it.
Absolutely. Let me just okay. I know, I'm sorry, I'm just fielding, seeing
Okay,
if anything else has come in. Just lots of wonderful praise and thank yous.
I wish I could hear the applause. It's so lonely sitting here in front of a computer.
No, I know. Well, Donna and I will clap on behalf of all of our.
I just meaning it's a state of silence. I love to be in the room with my people, with the audience.
Absolutely, art is a social thing, which is part of why we all love it, I'm sure.
Exactly. There's sonic deprivation at this end.
Well, I will clap on behalf of everyone. Thank you again, Richard, for such a wonderful and interesting lecture. Again, something that that not a lot of us know about in depth. So I wanted to personally thank you, of course, as well as a fellow proud Rutgers alum. And I'd like to thank Donna for joining us and Whitney for her help in coordinating this event. And I'd also just like to, let's see, I'll drop in the chat the Zimmerly at Home website. You can be sure to check that out for all of our upcoming future events. And I would also like to take this opportunity to announce our next exclusive members event, which will take place on May 20th at 6 p.m. It's entitled Social Justice as a Theme in Jewish Art with Margaret Olin, who's the senior research scholar at the Yale Department of History of Art, and Hannah Shaw, a graduate assistant at the Zimmerly. So that should be a very interesting lecture as well. Be sure to check your emails as that official invitation comes your way. So once again, thank you, Richard. Thank you to all our fabulous members and guests. And until next time, once again, thank you all so much.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to return to Rutgers. I appreciate very much the invitation.
Excellent. And we can't wait to see you when we open our doors to come for a visit.
Tell me when it is. Tell me when you open.
Awesome. We'll keep you all posted. Thanks, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Richard.
All right. You're very welcome. Thank you.